Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, within the last few hours, the United States Senate has begun confirmation hearings for President Trump's pick to fill a vacancy on the U.S. Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. Ms Barrett is seen as a dream nominee for those on the ideological right, a formidable intellect, and a devout Catholic. And with 7 children, she is something of a staunchly traditional supermom. Her appointment would cement a conservative majority on the hugely influential body, which is also America's highest court, with enormous implications for the nation. The Republican push is like nothing seen in U.S. political history, so close to a presidential election.
In filling Judge Ginsburg's seat, the stakes are extraordinarily high for the American people, both in the short term and for decades to come. Most importantly, health care coverage for millions of Americans is at stake with this nomination. We will examine the consequences if, and that's a big if, Republicans succeed in rushing this nomination through the Senate before the next president takes office. And when he appointed Judge Barrett to fill Justice Ginsburg's seat, the president said that eliminating the Affordable Care Act would be, quote, a big win for the USA. Judge Barrett, you've been critical of Chief Justice Roberts for his 5-4 opinion upholding the law, stating that Roberts, quote, pushed the Affordable Care Act beyond its plausible meaning to save the statute, end quote. This well could mean that if Judge Barrett is confirmed, Americans stand to lose the benefits that the ACA provides. So I hope you will clarify that in this hearing.
The person appearing before this committee is in a category of excellence, something the country should be proud of, and she will have a chance to make her case to be a worthy successor and to become the 9th member of the Supreme Court of the United States. This is a vacancy that has occurred through a tragic loss of a great woman, and we're going to fill that vacancy with another great woman.
Well, for more on the issues surrounding Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court confirmation hearings, I'm joined now by Arise special correspondent Karl Bostic, who's kept an eye on all of this. Thank you for coming in, Karl. How fiery a confirmation hearing is this likely to be over the next 4 days?
It'll be fiery, Charles, because the battle lines are clearly drawn along partisan lines, and this is not just a confirmation hearing happening in isolation. If it were, it would be pretty, dry like stale bread. Instead, these are very combustible times. You're having a situation not only of the coronavirus pandemic, which has convulsed the country for the past several months going back to spring, but you're also in the midst of an election. Not only just an election year per se, Charles, you already have millions of people already voting in 40 states. With Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, of course, that created a vacancy, but this is the opening that the Republicans, especially Donald Trump, was craving, because it allowed an opportunity to nominate and appoint someone to the Supreme Court that can make it decisively conservative, even though we were weeks away from the election. And that's why it's so fiery. That's why it's so partisan, because, again, just to put things in perspective, Charles, from nomination to confirmation, because they have the numbers, she could become, confirmed within a 2-week period. On average, it's anywhere from 56 days to even 70 days before someone can be confirmed. And so for that reason, I think we have some numbers to show you about just why the math doesn't work in the favor of the Democrats. We have here, it's the Judiciary Committee that's now holding the hearings today. 12 Republicans, Charles, 10 Democrats. And once they nominate her to go to the full floor for a Senate vote, that's 53 Republicans, 47 Democrats. So if anyone knows basic math, you see that Republicans have the upper hand. The problem is there's not much room for error, because you have a situation at this particular time, Charles, where you have some senators who've already tested positive who are sick, who are testing remotely, for example. And at the same time, there could be procedural delays, Charles.
So clearly, from the figures that you showed us, the Democrats don't have the votes to stop this, and they're pretty angry about the politics of it all, isn't it? So that's where they're aiming for, the politics.
Absolutely, Charles. In fact, let's again take a quick look at just what this timetable looks like, Charles. I think we've got some more text to show you about how this is going to map out. So today, for example, what we're seeing are the opening statements from all 22 Senate members, Charles, 10 minutes apiece. Tomorrow, Tuesday, is the beginning of the fiery exchanges you may be referring to. Those would be the question and answer Q&A period, multiple rounds perhaps. Senators will get 30 minutes each to weigh in. So that's where we may see someone like a Senator Kamala Harris, who's speaking remotely, talking, asking her questions. Wednesday, more Q&A, but this time senators will only get 20 minutes each. So then we go into Thursday. I think we've got the next slide to show you of text. If we can go forward to the next slide. On Thursday, we've got outside witnesses being called in. They'll testify for or against the Barrett nomination. Charles, all of this is basically according to script, according to plan, no deviation. They don't expect any further rounds of questioning past this unless there are some startling revelations, for example. So after this committee completes the hearing, Lindsey Graham, who's the chairman of the committee, he can then move to hold the committee to vote to send it to the floor. The Democrats, by procedure, can say, well, let's just wait a week while we just mull over this. They're entitled to do that. That's why we probably won't see a full vote until October 22nd next week. And then finally, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader, he's expecting to hold the vote no later than October 29th, Charles. And if you look at the election calendar, Charles, that's only 4 days before election. So if you want to talk about taking an express train with the brakes off, there are no local stops in this process. But that's why people are so angry. But getting back to your question, at the very least, even though they don't have the math in their favor in terms of the votes to block it, for example, what they can do, they can send out a message, they can mobilize people. They can say that, we're sending someone for a lifetime appointment who's going to affect a generation of people in their daily lives, ranging from women's rights, abortion rights, same-sex marriage, gun control, climate change. So you put on notice those Republican senators who are voting for it. And as it is, Charles, the final mention on this is that some of the senators on this committee are very vulnerable. And they're vulnerable in states where people are gripped by coronavirus. They're relying on the affordable health care plan called Obamacare to pay for their insurance, to pay for their costs. So they're very nervous when they see this person who's an appointee who's maybe actually not for this health care thing because, among other things, it provides for coverage of abortion and things like that. So it's a very, very loaded appointment.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, that this is obviously going to be a galvanizing force, not just for President Trump's Republican base, but also for even moderate Republicans, most of whose ideology is conservative. Because, we're not talking about whether Donald Trump is going to be reelected or not. You're talking about the very fundamental ideology of conservative.
Well, let's take that apart in two pieces, if we may, Charles. You talk about the fundamental conservatives. If anything, this nomination by Donald Trump, this would allow him to take credit for having appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. I'm not sure if that's ever been done in the first term of any president in American history. This would decisively move the court to the conservative side of things, and maybe overturning, liberal laws and such. So if anything, this is like Donald Trump delivering to the evangelicals. And this is the gamble they took on him despite his shortcomings. And now he wants to collect that gamble. He wants to collect it at the polls if they can mobilize enough. That's the real challenge right there.
Right. But what is interesting about it is that I've heard it said that if Donald Trump secures this Supreme Court seat, as seems probable, even if he doesn't win the election, his presidency will be deemed a success by the ideological right and by evangelical Christians. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, again, going back to what I just said, yes, he's delivered for them. He's expecting that collection. But then let's just talk very briefly about the fact of the election itself. If the election is so close, it's thrown into doubt, it could go into the direction of the courts, especially if there are disputed results because of just the torrent of absentee mail-in ballots. And in fact, Donald Trump, the president, he even said himself, this is going to go to the courts. He's kind of telegraphing the fact that I want to make sure I have, quote, my justice in place on the Supreme Court who will rule in favor of me. That's why, Charles, one of the questions expected to be answered during these hearings is that would she recuse herself from any ruling on the validity of results from a state when she's actually just been appointed by someone who wanted her to be in place on time to rule in his favor. That's a loaded concern right there, Charles.
It is indeed a loaded concern, and it's absolutely fascinating for students of American politics. But returning to that issue of the politics of all of this, how much do these hearings present the Republicans with a chance to redirect the agenda away from the coronavirus just over 3 weeks before the elections?
Well, you kind of answered the question yourself, Charles. I mean, let's be honest, not 3 weeks, but 22 days. And, Donald Trump himself has been hospitalized and is now recovering and hopefully well. But that's part of the challenge, Charles, because he's been trailing in polls nationally and in battleground states to Joe Biden for the past several months. And despite the first debate debacle, despite being hospitalized, despite coming out of the hospital, actually that gap has widened. And so the problem now for Donald Trump is that he's trying to change the narrative. The reason why he's so far behind is because people just don't like the way he's handled the response. They think basically he's botched it. We have to have more than 200,000 Americans who have been killed. And he's trying to turn the page on that. He wants to say, listen, I've got your Supreme Court justice on the bench now. I'm taking care of that. I'm the one who can return the economy to full steam ahead. Let's not talk about the coronavirus, because don't let it dominate your life. Don't fear it. And yet that's what the Democrats are saying, like Kamala Harris in her debate saying, they're coming after you. You're going to lose your coverage of those with pre-existing conditions, for example. So he wants to change the conversation. And this hearings is a spotlight for that. But for those vulnerable senators in states where you've got elderly people who are succumbing to the virus and people who are worried about being able to pay for those insurance costs, they're very nervous and rattled about the prospect of losing health care. One that will also appear before the Supreme Court just a week after the election.
Is there anything at all that the Democrats can pull out of a hat? Is there a rabbit hiding somewhere that they can pull out, apart from just giving the reasons why they don't think the hearings should be taking place right now?
Well, if it's a rabbit, Charles, it's a rabbit with a sprained ankle, because it won't be able to.
It won't be able to hop.
It won't be able to hop at all, Charles. If anything happens in their favor, it'll be because there's new revelations. For example, she's a very devout Catholic. She belonged to a charismatic church called People of Praise that does believe in a strict hierarchy that's based on being subservient to male authority and things like that. But nonetheless, they have to be careful, because the Democrats have to be careful about falling into a trap of saying, well, how much does your devout religion affect your policy? Because then the Republicans say that you're going after her being a Catholic, and that could actually have a backlash effect. So that's why Democrats.
Well, Joe Biden's a Catholic, but it doesn't make any difference.
Well, they have to remind people that. But that's why the Democrats are saying, let's talk about health care. Let's talk about the threat of losing it. But for the Republicans, they want to tell her narrative of being a supermom, able to still juggle the career as a high-powered circuit court judge and her husband, who's also a high-powered lawyer as well. And how do you manage raising 7 kids? They want to talk about that and not talk about her beliefs or philosophies, which quite frankly are antithetical to what the majority of Americans feel like in terms of abortion rights, gay rights, you name it.
Well, Karl, stay with us. I know you've had a long day, but we want to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the issues surrounding Amy Coney Barrett's Supreme Court confirmation hearing. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now, as you've probably heard, President Trump has restarted his U.S. election campaign following his COVID-19 diagnosis, and he and his Republican Party are also pushing ahead with the Supreme Court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. Despite calls from Democrats for a delay, the Senate Judiciary Committee has begun the confirmation hearings bright and early from 9 a.m. today, U.S. time, just weeks before the presidential election. For more on that, I'm joined in the studio by our special correspondent, Karl Bostic, who stayed with us. I mean, we'll return to that Supreme Court hearing in a moment, but I want to talk about the other issues that are coming into play in this American election that's, as you said, 22 days away. President Trump making a pitch for Black American and Latino voters. Is that message getting through?
Well, let's put this in perspective, Charles. Right now, in terms of his approval and popularity amongst African American or black voters, I mean, it's about 90% in favor of Joe Biden or Democrats and less than 10% for Donald Trump. Their strategy is that they can just even chip away a few points, that they can make some inroads, especially in those battleground states, which range from Michigan to Pennsylvania to Florida. And more specifically, the black vote is not a monolithic vote. You know, black women tend to be much more enthusiastic about Democratic candidates, especially now that Kamala Harris is running. And black males, for example, actually tend to be, if not more conservative, even less likely to vote. In fact, it was Donald Trump himself who was saying in a very cynical, backhanded way after the election, he wanted to thank Black Americans for their support. And do you know what he meant by that, Charles? He wanted to thank them for the support because Black Americans didn't even bother showing up at the polls to vote for Hillary Clinton because they were so non-enthusiastic about her. So that was his backhanded way of looking at it. But then again, you know, it's a way of saying that I can go after the black vote and just get a few points. And then when it comes to the Latino vote, that's actually much more complicated because, for example, depending on the state you're talking about, in Florida, the Latino vote is mostly a Cuban American vote that's very conservative. But if you're in other states like you know, Arizona or Nevada and so forth, it's a different sort of Hispanic vote that's really more malleable, that can become very, very competitive.
Especially given all the stuff around immigration and so on.
Right, but at the same time, ironically enough, just like the black vote is not monolithic, nor is the Latino vote, because a lot of Latin households, especially the men, they like Donald Trump. And so that's why, and people are worrying that Joe Biden has not been effective in courting the Latin vote. And that's kind of like an Achilles heel for him.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. And just returning to the African Americans, I mean, it's interesting, well, actually both, that the polling evidence shows that the black and Latino voters who supported Donald Trump in 2016 still appear to support him. I mean, how would you explain this, especially in light of Donald Trump's failure to condemn things like white supremacy?
I think it's like it's almost like kitchen table issues. It's about economy. It's about having a job.
Right.
You know, for those who have a job, you know, he's made a big, strong pitch towards making sure there are lifelines available.
So pocketbook economics, basically.
Yeah, it's economics in terms of small businesses, small business owners, and that sort of thing. And maybe law and order, especially if law and order is a threat to their business. That sort of dynamic. Nothing to do with racism and things like that.
Right, because I mean, there is evidence that unemployment in the black community has actually gone down during Donald Trump's time. I mean,
but relative to the coronavirus, it's actually gone up. So while unemployment is now slowly going down to like around 8 points or so, it's still high up for African Americans. It's still at about 10 or 11%.
And black women often portrayed in America, I heard somebody say, as women without value because they are black, and black people without respect because they are women. And then add to that Donald Trump calling Kamala Harris a monster last week. Does that explain to some extent why black women are so opposed to Mr. Trump?
That's only part of the reason, because you know, it's a mix of gender and race bias. In fact, every woman receives his scorn who doesn't agree with him. For example, the Michigan governor, Gretchen Whitmer, who he calls Gretchen Half-Wit, for example. He's got a nickname for everyone. Nancy Pelosi's Crazy Nancy, but one of his first White House aides was Omarosa Manigault, you remember? And
yes,
he called her a dog.
Yeah, I remember I actually met her in America. I interviewed her once. But I mean, it's interesting though that I'm just wondering, given all of that, because I mean, that's a pretty strong term to use when he referred to Kamala Harris as a monster. What difference do you think her role can make in this election, or is likely to make? Is that mobilizing for some and counter-mobilizing for others?
She'll be mobilizing the woman vote, who are aspirational, because she'll be, breaking an incredible glass ceiling if she becomes. She's already broken one by becoming the first woman of color as a running mate, but she's on the threshold of becoming the first woman vice president. She's a potential front runner for the presidency in 2024 for the Democratic Party. So all eyes are on her, even in this particular nomination hearing for Amy Coney Barrett. All eyes are watching on how she will handle her performance, or not performance, but her delivery in questioning Amy Coney Barrett. In fact, some people and commentators are saying that, above all, the most important strategy for her is to appear presidential. Everything she does now is through the lens of appearing presidential, and not as even a person of color or as a senator. So there's a lot of pressure on her, because she's really on a stage like she's never been on before. But the time is right. And in terms of mobilizing support, women are behind her, people of color are behind her, and of course you've got Joe Biden choosing her. A lot of Generation X, Generation Z people are excited by her.
Right. And just to go beyond Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, the U.S. Supreme Court, I understand that there are, in this election, more than 1,200 other candidates who are running for president, apart from Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump, who dominate, obviously, media coverage. Why is it that we never hear about the other candidates?
Well, you also have to put things in perspective, Charles, because it's a state-by-state process in that, you just can't raise your hand and say, I want to be president. I mean, you can do that, but then it takes more than raising your hand to get your name on the ballot. So for that sizable figure you're talking about, how many of the names are actually on the ballot? At best, those could be write-in names. For example, look at Kanye West, the pop star. Kanye West announced his candidacy for president, and he missed by various deadlines in certain states the ability or threshold to get on those ballots, because either he missed a deadline, or because he didn't have a threshold of enough signatures of votes supporting him as a petition. So you can easily announce your candidacy and have your name announced for write-in purposes. But to get your name on the ballot, that's something entirely different. And what's different with this campaign is, unlike 2016, you had the Green Party. You had the Green Party with Jill Stein. And in other past campaigns, you had other strong third-party contenders like Ross Perot. And they, in fact, were almost blamed for taking away chunks of the vote that Democrats would have gotten. In fact, the Green Party, Jill Stein's party, is basically blamed for harming Hillary's candidacy by taking away from votes. This year, coming around, Charles, there is no strong Green Party candidate at all, in part because there's such an animus, because the deep polarization to just getting Donald Trump out of the White House, and then settling their disputes in terms of a progressive agenda.
Right. I mean, we've seen in the past people like Ross Perot, independents like that, gaining quite a bit of traction. What are the chances of an outsider winning an election in America? The first U.S. president, George Washington, was an independent, wasn't he?
Yes. I mean, you're going back centuries now, Charles. And in fact, there used to be the Whig Party. There was, I believe, one of the major candidates was, if not president, was a Whig president as well. And I think it's definitely a two-party system. Some would argue that's maybe a flaw, a shortcoming of democracy in America, because it doesn't meet the aspirations of all Americans. And that's why you've got the third party, like the Green Party, coming up. And that's why you see it as a strong party, for example, in countries like Germany, let's say. So, but for this election, I think it's so polarized. The only significance of a third party is if it can harm the other party.
Okay, Karl, thank you very much indeed. Always appreciate your analysis. Karl Bostic, our special correspondent. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.